All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of John. Before we jump into the content for this session, I just wanted to remind you of the listener's commentary app. I know sometimes it can be really frustrating when it's like I'm working through the Gospel of Luke, or I'm listening to the letter of Ephesians, or I'm trying to study the book of Philippians, whatever it is, and it's like 3 years ago or 4 years ago. And so you got to keep constantly scrolling through your feed to find where you're at. And what a frustrating experience that is. And that's the reason we created the app, is to make listening so much easier. So you can listen by book. So you just choose Ephesians and it'll just immediately have in order the feed for the commentary on Ephesians. And then you can just study straight through that. So we've gotten some feedback on some other things to improve and fix on that app. So we'll keep adding and improving it. But for now, it's there, it's available, and it makes navigating the commentary so much easier. So don't miss that. And check out the Listener's Commentary app. Download it on either your iPhone, from the App Store, or from Google Play on your Android. All right, in this session, we're going to be looking at John 7:53 through 8:11. And there's two things we have to address by way of introduction before we get to the details of the text. First is, as always, the context. So we want to make sure we set that in context. And the other thing is this part of the original Gospel of John or not? You'll notice if you're looking at that text right in front of you that a lot of them will have brackets in there to mark this text out. And so let's take that question first. Is this part of the original or not? And the reality is we have no ancient manuscripts of the Gospel of John that includes it prior to the 400s. So for the first several hundred years of the church, this story wasn't included in the Gospel manuscripts. Nevertheless, it's had a long history as a recognized part of the Gospel. Well over 1,300 years, it's been part of the Gospel and cherished by the church. So the fact is we don't know for sure. Chances are, since it doesn't show up in the earliest manuscripts, it's probably not necessarily part of the original manuscript of the gospel. Nevertheless, as a number of scholars have said, whether it's part of the original or not, it fits everything we know about Jesus. It fits his character, the mission of his ministry and life. In fact, some scholars contend that even if it's unoriginal to the Gospel of John, it likely preserves or reports a true story from Jesus' ministry. And as part of the Gospel as we now have it, it serves really an important purpose here in the flow of John's Gospel. It heightens the tension as the leaders now are seeking to trap Jesus. And it shows Jesus as the true judge, the only one without sin, who therefore is qualified to judge, and he himself grants mercy to this woman. And so it really has an important function in the flow of the narrative here at this point in John's Gospel. And so with that, let's talk a little bit about the context before we jump into the details. Jesus has been in Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, or also known as the Feast of Booths. And while he was there, he announced that he was the true well of living water, the well of salvation. And there was a mixed reaction to him and to his claim. Some of the crowd believed him. Some people thought the authorities should arrest him. The leaders themselves sent officials to arrest him. And there's this mixed reaction to him. And this particular scene, what is often referred to as the woman caught in adultery, takes place in the temple after the feast. And it shows the authorities are looking for grounds to arrest Jesus, thus furthering the plot and heightening the tension of the gospel. So the story begins at the end of chapter 7. There's this last little sentence that is actually part of this story. It says, "And everyone went home, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives." And remember, the Mount of Olives is just outside the city of Jerusalem. And so this little passing sentence wraps up what just happened, Jesus' interaction in the temple on the Feast of Tabernacles, and sets up what comes next. And so everyone goes to their house. Jesus goes out of town to the Mount of Olives. and perhaps he has his booth or shelter set up there somewhere on the Mount of Olives for the feast, who knows? But he goes out to the Mount of Olives. And then we pick up in chapter 8 where it says, "And early in the morning, he came again into the temple, and all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and he began teaching them." And so he comes back into the temple area and he's teaching the people. So you got to picture a crowd of people around him in a very public space with lots of activity in the massive, perhaps open courtyards of the temple. Now, verse 3, the scribes, recall who they are. They're the experts in Jewish law. So the scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman caught in the act of adultery. Notice that it seems as if there's no question. There's no mystery. She has been caught red-handed in the very act of adultery. So they bring her to Jesus there in the temple with all these people around him where he's been teaching. And after placing her in the center, this particular translation adds the word, the center of the courtyard. And clearly they are in a courtyard, but it might be better to picture this as in the center of the people. They bring her to Jesus, and people are gathered around him, and they place her right there in the middle of everything that's going on. And they emphasize the seriousness of this charge against her and how clear the evidence is against this woman. Look what they say in verse 4. They said to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the very act of committing adultery." Again, the evidence is clear. It's not debatable. This woman is an adulteress. We caught her in the very act itself. So they want to know what Jesus says to do. And they do so by pitting Moses against Jesus. Look at verse 5. After affirming that this woman clearly is an adulteress, they say to Jesus, "Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say?" Notice, as the way they say it, how they pit Moses against Jesus. And they want to know what Jesus will say with regard to the law of Moses concerning stoning a woman who is an adulteress. What law are they referring to? Well, probably the law found in Deuteronomy 22, verse 22, which says, "If a man is found sleeping with a married woman, then both of them shall die, the man who slept with the woman and the woman. So you shall eliminate the evil from Israel." Notice it doesn't specify stoning, so they've added the method of execution. Moses commanded us to stone such women. Well, it doesn't quite say that. They've added that. That's all right. It does say they shall die. And they haven't brought the man. That's, I think, a greater oversight. Where's the man? The text says to stone the man and the woman, or to put to death the man and the woman. Where is he? And it almost makes you wonder if this whole thing was actually a setup, that they had somebody entrap this woman so they could bring this woman to Jesus in an effort to try to trip Jesus up and have grounds for arresting him. So they bring her now to Jesus in public with all sorts of people looking on in a very public space, and they ask him, "Moses says this, what do you say?" And John, in verse 6, tells us their end game. Look at verse 6. Now, they were saying this to test him so that they might have grounds for accusing him. They aren't looking for guidance. They don't really care to know what he thinks. They believe he's a lawbreaker. They believe he deserves to be arrested, tried, and eliminated. And they think they found a way to trap him. Jesus' response to their question is actually quite surprising. Look what happens in the second half of verse 6. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. Keep in mind where he's at. He's in the temple. The temple courtyard is made out of large stone blocks, and the stone is covered with sand and dust there in the arid climate of Jerusalem. And so they ask him this. They seem to be putting him in a position where, man, how does he get out of this one? And Jesus' first response is to bend down, stoop down, squat down, and begin writing or doodling in the dirt there on the temple floor. We have no idea what he wrote. And even though we have no idea what he wrote, that hasn't stopped commentators and preachers from coming up with all sorts of creative ideas. He wrote the names of people they had committed adultery with. He listed off the commands of the 10 Commandments. He wrote down other sins these people had committed. We have no idea, and we should just be content with that. We should be content with what John has actually told us and what he hasn't told us. And John didn't feel it was necessary to tell us what Jesus wrote, only that he did. So Jesus' first reaction is to stoop down and start writing or doodling in the dirt on the temple grounds. And those who were trying to trap him feel like he's stalling. So they push, verse 7. When they persisted in asking him, he straightened up and said to them, notice that, they kept asking him. He's doodling in the ground. They kept asking him, wait a second, look, this is what Moses says. What do you say? How are you going to treat this woman? What should we do with her? And they keep asking. So when they persisted in asking him, he stands back up and he said to them, he who is without sin among you, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. And these words of Jesus are likely intended to recall the instruction in the Old Testament law that witnesses against a person needed to be the ones that were going to cast the first stone. You can find that law in Deuteronomy 13:9, Deuteronomy 17:7. The whole purpose of this law was to actually make being a witness a very serious and responsible thing, and thereby to minimize the ease of being a false witness. If you're the one that actually has to throw the first stone and put somebody to death because of your testimony, that all of a sudden heightens the stakes of the game. And so Jesus' words are probably intended to recall that instruction. Remember, scribes and Pharisees, they're experts in these things. And that's certainly the effect of Jesus' words here. Look at verse 8. After he said these things, Jesus stooped back down, wrote some more on the ground. So he stands up, he says these words, stoops back down, and just starts looking at the dirt and writing in the dirt. Now, when they heard this, verse 9, they began leaving one by one, beginning with the older ones, and then Jesus was left alone, and the woman, where she was, in the center of all these people, the center here of the temple. Jesus' response is simple, but it's powerful, and it had just the intended effect on these people, right? They brought this woman to Jesus, intending to trap him with the question of, should we stone her? And Jesus' response is essentially, be honest with yourself. Be honest with yourself about your own sin, maybe even your own sin of hypocrisy, your own sin of trying to trap me, your own sin perhaps of setting up this woman. We don't know all that went through their mind, but Jesus' words are, be honest with yourself. If you haven't sinned, you pick up the first stone. And they decided not to pick up stones and throw them at this woman. They began leaving. Notice the older ones first, the ones who maybe were a little wiser, had a little more like self-awareness and self-understanding, the ones who were a little less fiery. They began walking away first, and Jesus is left there with this woman in the middle of all these people. And once again, verse 10, straightening up, Jesus said to her, woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you? Now, recall, first off, when Jesus speaks to her as, woman, where are they? That's the same way he addressed his mom at the wedding in Cana in chapter 2. And we noted there that this is actually a term of respect. Jesus is speaking to her with kindness, gentleness, and respect. So we need to make sure we hear it that way. Woman, where are they? This is tenderness and respect. Did no one condemn you? It's also significant to acknowledge that Jesus acknowledges her, engages her in conversation. It's not just enough for him to best his opponents. He wants to redeem this woman. And so he looks her in the eyes and engages her in conversation and asks her, where did they go? Did no one condemn you? And she responded in verse 11, no one, Lord. And Jesus said to her, I do not condemn you either. Go from now on and sin no longer. Notice, Jesus, the only one truly qualified to judge, the only one who's without sins and therefore could theoretically pick up the first stone, he doesn't. He chooses not to condemn. He is a merciful judge. Now, that doesn't mean she hadn't done anything wrong, and it doesn't mean Jesus is lowering the standards, lowering the bar so that he can let her off the hook. That's not the way God's mercy and grace works. Look at the very last line. Go, from now on, don't sin any longer. Jesus holds her accountable for her sin. He names it and calls it out. and tells her to stop doing that. So she clearly has done something wrong. She's broken the law. But Jesus is more interested in rescuing and redeeming her from that way of life than condemning her. And so Jesus doesn't lower the standards and say, it doesn't really matter. He keeps the standards high. He calls sin sin, but he grants her mercy nonetheless. And my encouragement to you and to I as we read this particular story is just to read it imaginatively, to read it meditatively, to try to picture the story. Like if you were going to make a movie out of this scene, what does it look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? Picture it from the angle of the religious leaders who somehow were there, caught this woman. Was it a setup or not? We don't know for sure. We're not told, but somehow they caught her in the very act. How did that happen? They bring her to Jesus, and they have no regard for her well-being. They're only interested in using her as a pawn in their play to trap Jesus. Picture the scene from their angle. What do they look like? What do they sound like? What kind of facial expressions do they have? Picture it from the angle of the crowd who's sitting there around this whole situation, this scene, as this woman is brought up and Jesus is put in this difficult spot, and you can feel the tension in the air, and they're watching on and they're wondering, oh no, this is not good. We know they want to get him. Is this the moment? And some of them maybe are sympathetic to the religious leaders, like adulteresses need to be dealt with. We can't take sin lightly. How is Jesus going to deal with that? Some of them may be sympathetic to Jesus. And so picture from the angle of the crowd. What do they see? What are they thinking? If you're sitting in the crowd, what are you observing in this whole moment? What are you wondering? And what questions do you have? Picture it from the perspective of the woman. This woman has been grabbed by these men who have authority to deal with her in significant ways, who drag her into the temple and put her right in front of Jesus and call her out and name her sin right in front of all these people who are listening to Jesus teach. Picture from her angle. What is she doing? What's the look on her face? Does her head hang down as she just looks at the ground because she's completely been shamed? Is it dishonored? Does she make eye contact with Jesus? Does he make eye contact with her? Picture from her scene. What does it look like as you meditate on this story? And finally, picture from the perspective of Jesus. What tone of voice does he use? What does he look like? How does he look at this woman particularly when he gauges her at the end and he talks with her? What's the tone of his voice? What's the look in his eye? What does it sound like when he says to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more"? Picture this story from various vantage points. Meditate on it, sit in it, and in your own prayerful meditation, receive as well the mercy from the just judge of the universe. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's only possible because of the generosity of dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton to each and every one of you, genuinely and sincerely. Thanks a ton for making this ministry possible. I get emails almost every week from people who are using it for sermon prep, who are using it in their own personal Bible study, who are new to reading the scriptures and for the first time feel like they're able to engage the scriptures in a way that makes sense to them. So your generosity is bearing fruit for God's kingdom's sake all around the world. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, you can do so by going to listenerscommentary.com. You can either sign up for the study hub right there, get access to some online courses and an increasing amount of bonus material to help you dig in and learn and live the Bible, or you can click the give button. It'll redirect you to my page with World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit. You can put in a dollar amount. You can click a little box that makes this monthly if you want to make it a monthly donation, and you can support this ministry right there. Thanks a ton for your support.